Requiem for a camp, post-mortem for a drug war institution. And Dr. Corva is a visiting assistant professor in public policy at Sarah Lawrence. He received a PhD in geography at the University of Washington in 2010. I'm from Oregon, so I'm a duck. And you're
Husky, dude.
Husky, you're a husky. We're enemies. He received his PhD in geography from Washington, where he focused on the political economy of narco-governance in Latin America. His postdoctoral research project on the political economy of policing cannabis agriculture in southern Humboldt is a domestic sequel to his dissertation work, but remains firmly rooted in questions of social justice associated with the globalization of the U.S. war on drugs. So we're really blessed to have Dominic here. Folks that are doing this research, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a lot of people doing research in this area. He's one of the guys that is leading the way around understanding drug policy in the United States and how it affects us here in Humboldt County. So I want to welcome Dominic and thank you for coming.
Thanks, Tony. Hi, everyone. I have a talk script which isn't optimal, but for a longer lecture, sort of necessary. I'll be referring to some slides as we go along, so there'll be occasionally pretty pictures, hopefully. One of them has already proved problematic because we transferred the PowerPoint file to this computer that needs a QuickTime compressor. So no great loss, but anyway, let's begin. This talk presents a paper in progress about the life and death of California's Campaign Against Marijuana Planting, or CAMP. It is part of my broader postdoctoral research project investigating the birthplace of contemporary domestic cannabis agriculture in the United States. It is an oral history project of cannabis agriculture and changes over time in southern Humboldt as the core geographical region for the emergence of what Camp first called the Emerald Triangle. And we get our first pretty picture. See? See? Yeah. And all of these are apparently, I thought there was only one that was giving me a problem, and now it's 3. Let me actually improvise then. So, what is the Emerald Triangle in the popular geographical imagination? What does it refer to? Mendocino, Humboldt, and Trinity counties. This is a bit of a problematic geographical imagination. However, we're going to get into maybe where that comes from. Specifically speaking, domestic sinsemilla growing really takes off in the watersheds on the border of southern Humboldt and Mendocino County, and out a little bit into Trinity. This is the direct result of people settling at the end of the 1960s, buying land, especially from Bob McKee, who continues to be an interesting figure in the area. The first purchases from land that McKee subdivided were in Whale Gulch, which stretches down into Mendocino. So the actual location is sort of a trans-county region of watersheds, actually, and not separated by those sort of artificial lines that people put on a map that was going to be one of those images, so I was going to complicate that. The purpose is to construct a partial genealogy of the domestication of one particular illicit drug crop, cannabis, during a period of U.S. history when most other economic sectors around the world were globalizing rather than localizing. And also, during that same period, a time when the U.S. globalized what is often called prohibition, but more significantly what is often called prohibition, which is illegal forbidding of something happening, but involves lots of messy enforcement realities that shape geographies of the commodity chains. In Latin America, the policing of illicit drug agriculture was politically connected to writing and enforcing rules associated with economic liberalization in those countries. Simultaneous efforts to open up borders to illicit capital and commodity flows while closing them to illicit drug capital and commodity flows produced contradictory and messy outcomes for millions of people caught in the middle. One of those, for example, was the popular legitimation of Bolivian coca politics that would eventually lead in 2005 to the election of the first indigenous president in Bolivian history, the president of the Coca Growers Union, Evo Morales. The U.S. promoted war on drugs in Latin America was always much more controversial there than it was here, and accomplished through a combination of coercive economic threats on the one hand and financial aid rewards that were especially attractive during a regional debt crisis that began in the early 1980s and more and or less ended with the beginning of the global commodity boom in approximately 2003. As Latin American countries emerged from the debt crisis about 10 years ago, they found themselves in a more autonomous position vis-a-vis the drug war. Today, Latin American heads of state and grassroots social movements are among the loudest critics of drug war institutions and militarized approaches associated with the U.S. model. In a global context, consent to the U.S. war on drugs has waned to the point of defection. Given that the lifespan of CAMP as a domestic drug war institution for policing rural illicit drug crops spanned exactly the same time period, an analysis of its career offers a unique comparative window into the time and space of the U.S. war on drugs in a global context. I begin by situating the magnitude of cannabis production in California at the present time. California is at the moment the largest producer of cannabis in the U.S., the largest exporter of cannabis to other states, and the largest source of cannabis consumed in the U.S., according to government sources. One of them, a 2010 Central Valley High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Program report, using methodologies associated with the United Nations Office of Drug Control, calculated that California may supply up to 79% of the nation's cannabis supply using UNODC methods. California's estimated production totals exceed those of Mexico, our next largest source of cannabis, by about 45%. Those estimates were made in 2010, 27 years after the formal creation of the nation's most systematic and enduring joint task force for eradicating cannabis in California, CAMP. In the decade before CAMP's creation, most cannabis consumed in the U.S. came from abroad. Between the 60s and the 90s, Mexico and Colombia at different times were the biggest sources for domestic consumption, although Jamaica, Thailand, and for a brief moment, Belize exported significant quantities. It should be noted in the days before CAMP, a much greater quantity of hashish was also imported from outside the hemisphere, a cannabis derivative with comparable THC concentrations to those found in Sinsemilla today. The historically informed or astute observer might notice that while cannabis production tends to precede drug war interventions in each of these places, with the exception of Belize, vast amounts of drug war funding correlate in the long run with increased rather than decreased production and transit of illicit drug crops and commodity chains. Correlation does not prove causation, but is worth asking into the role of policing illicit drug space and expanding illicit drug production. What role have geographies of policing played in the expansion and transformation of cannabis agriculture in California? This is the subject of my presentation today. It draws on CAMP report archives, ethnographic interviews, and secondary data sources to locate the significance of CAMP, its demise, and enduring legacy for the political economy of domestic illicit cannabis production. It is divided into three parts. The presentation will focus first on the geopolitics of its emergence, second, on industrial balloon effects associated with its geographies of enforcement, and C, the eclipse of its foundational logic and practice, territorial logic and practice, policing the Emerald Triangle, by new political and economic geographies of power, particularly environmental geopolitics and economic crisis. Before discussing the geopolitics of CAMP's emergence, a caveat about the empirics on which this paper is based. First, I want to note that due to the clandestine nature of the industry and the fact that law enforcement prioritizes action over accounting, we should think about any numbers presented or remembered as data shadows rather than accurate measures of prices in plants. They are all we have to go on. If you want to know more about data shadows, Monica Stevens is going to be giving a presentation in the spring and can sort of explain that concept a little better. Second, the perspectives and memories of folks who have been kind enough to give me their time are human and therefore situated rather than universal knowledge claims. I've interviewed more than 40 people at this point, about 10% of whom have experienced the industry indirectly as professionals in public or private industry. Their memories provide more nuanced context for the archival data and secondary sources that have been consulted, but they do not and cannot provide the whole picture. No such claim is being made as a result. That said, let us begin with the geopolitics of campus emergence. Geopolitics, from the perspective of one of my discipline's subfields, critical geopolitics, refers broadly to the inscription of power relations in space. It includes state practices and genealogies of governance, but it also includes contestations and counter-geographies of such inscriptions above and below the scale of the nation-state. The subfield of critical geopolitics emerged from critiques of U.S. intervention in Latin America, El Salvador in particular, on the grounds that post-colonial revolutionary movements were but a pretext for the spread of communism, on the grounds of, not saying that that's what the pretext was. That was the state discourse. Gerard Toll, the founder of the subdiscipline, sought to deconstruct state discourses of security that multiplied rather than mitigated conflicts, that had their own local reasons for emergence and reproduction. At the end of the Cold War, new discourses of security and threat emerged that underwrote new legitimations for intervention from afar, that also seemed to exacerbate rather than mitigate conditions of human security. One of these is the global war on drugs, which evolved over the course of a century, but became codified and inserted into debates about security associated with processes and relations of political and economic globalization during the early 1970s. While the U.S. has long produced interventions associated with policing illicit drug flows, it was not until the 1980s that the U.S. began to systematize policies and practices for integrating drug war policing with modes of governance associated with globalization. Fundamental to the institutionalization of the global drug war was, in the beginning, a strategic focus on illicit drug crop production as the root of the problem. This was partially pragmatic, since illicit drug crop farmers are much easier to locate than transit and finance, and also because illicit drug crop farmers are consistently located on the political and economic margins of modern state societies. That description more or less applies to the first wave of cannabis growers who settled in southern Humboldt and Mendocino watersheds, especially in Whale Gulch, Salmon Creek, Bryceland, and maybe Honeydew. I want to start out our consideration of politics of policing cannabis in the U.S. as an outgrowth of the so-called culture wars of the 1960s, which were embedded in social struggles of the time. Literally and or figuratively, the first wave of settlers to what is now called the Emerald Triangle were veterans of new social movements that were especially prominent on the Berkeley campus of the 1960s, where Ronald Reagan made his political career persecuting campus radicals and countercultural hippies who were often part of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury scene. Anti-imperialist politics cross-fertilized with countercultural politics to produce hippie radicals, like Abby Hoffman's Yippies, who owed much of their political philosophy to Bay Area diggers. High Times magazine was actually started by a Yippie, and here's their flag. Maybe. There we go. Yay. So what do you see when you see this flag? What does it tell you? Anybody? You want me to tell you? Okay. Cannabis was definitely part of their politics, but it was linked to, what's the red star? Communism and the anti-imperialist struggles, particularly in Latin America, South Asia, and the global South at the time. Might seem odd to link cannabis to the red star in this fashion, but the Yippies were an odd bunch. But they also reflect the hybridization of cultural politics with politics, and economic politics, geopolitics as well. A little bit more on that in a moment. I'm not sure how familiar this audience might be with the trajectory of the 1960s, but a significant national student political organization was created at the beginning of the 60s called the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. As the Vietnam War abroad and the war on inner-city people of color at home intensified towards the end of the 60s, a radicalized faction of the SDS formed the Weatherman Underground. No matter what one thinks of their politics, it's hard not to give them some credit for the radicalization of national politics against marijuana. On May 21st, 1970, their first communique was released and read on airwaves across the nation. The following is an excerpt. Hello, this is Bernadine Dorn. I'm going to read a declaration of a state of war, all caps. This is the first communication from the Weatherman Underground. All over the world, people fighting American, with a K, imperialism look to America America's youth, to use our strategic position behind enemy lines to join forces in the destruction of the empire. ... A lot missing in there. We fight in many ways. Dope is one of our weapons. The laws against marijuana mean that millions of us are outlaws long before we actually split. Guns and grass are united in the youth underground. Freaks are revolutionaries, and revolutionaries are freaks. If you want to find us, this is where we are. In every tribe, commune, dormitory, farmhouse, barracks, and townhouse where kids are making love, smoking dope, and loading guns, fugitives from American justice are free to go. I use this quote to demonstrate that it wasn't just state authorities that came to characterize cannabis, and by association countercultural hippies, as enemies of society. The culture wars, as they have come to be called, created exaggerated impressions of cannabis-related social disorder that politicians from both parties would mobilize in the coming decades as political capital. This was a national political context that was reinvigorated by the election of countercultural archenemy Ronald Reagan to the presidency in 1980. The global context for camp's emergence and the national political climate informed by the culture wars tell us a little about how a state initiative like CAMP could sound good to federal drug warriors, but less about the joint federal, state, and local task force as an interscalar node of governance linking political interests across space and through time. Although the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, provided the key resources for CAMP, especially helicopters, it did not have the authority to constitute CAMP as a state-level institution. CAMP was formally constituted in 1983 by California's newly elected Attorney General, Democrat John Van de Kamp. I don't think it's a coincidence. The previous Attorney General, George, help me out with the pronunciation, Woods? Duke Majan, thank you, had just been elected to succeed Jerry Brown as governor of California. Brown's father, incidentally, also served as Attorney General on his way to becoming governor of California. So I think it's important context to understand that the Office of Attorney General, the top state law enforcement position, was and remains a political office, a possible trajectory to further success in politics. And in fact, Van de Kamp ran in the Democratic primaries for governor at the end of his second AG term in 1990. He lost to Dianne Feinstein and subsequently retired from politics. Van de Kamp was a law and order Democrat at a time when law and order politicians were ascendant nationally. As sociologist Catherine Beckett writes in Making Crime Pay, Law and Order in American Politics, the 1980s were marked by an explosion of moral panic, especially around drug crimes. She locates the source of that panic not in rising violent crime rates, which were actually on the decline, but the rise of national corporate media coverage more interested in selling spectacular stories than empirical accuracy. The saturation of the nation's airwaves and newspaper pages with stories of spectacular, usually racialized violence helped make the war on drugs a winning issue for Democrats and Republicans alike, as they competed with each other to see who could be more tough on drugs. And indeed, camp reports do seem to systematically exaggerate the relationship between cannabis agriculture and violence. The 1983 report asserts that violence has become a way of life in the marijuana-growing communities, an assertion contested, albeit often in a nuanced fashion, by most of my interviewees. It may be that the murder of Salmon Creek resident Kathy Davis by disgruntled employees of her grower boyfriend not long before the advent of camp and made the cover of Life magazine prompted Van de Kamp's interest in forming camp. Whatever the proximate cause, the creation of camp was one of the first political policing campaigns created by a law and order attorney general in California at a time when backlash against the countercultural 60s met profit-oriented spectacular media coverage. This was a favorable climate indeed for a rural policing program against hippie communities that had recently discovered that their favorite sacrament could also make back-to-the-land life a little more comfortable. Although camp appears to have exaggerated the magnitude of violence associated with cannabis agriculture in the region, my research subjects do acknowledge increasing levels of violence associated with the migration of new people to the area to make money rather than create a community based on back-to-the-land principles. One subject identified a San Francisco Chronicle front-page story in August of 1977 as the tipping point for this phenomenon. You can see, here's the cover. I don't know, you don't have to read too much, but you can see how a town got high, specifically about Garberville. in 1977. Pot bonanza for Humboldt County. Locates Garberville up there, and San Francisco's, of course, down there. It's like giving them a roadmap to a gold rush, which is sort of how the article reads. Plenty of recent media coverage describes such migration in this decade as a green rush, but it seems to be an ongoing dynamic that began in the late 70s, continued steadily, and intensified after the 1996 passage of Prop 215, which I will talk about a bit in the third and final part of this presentation. This concludes the presentation of the part of my paper that is about the geopolitics of camp's emergence. By way of transition, I want to describe competing representations of camp policing practices and how local communities responded during Van de Kamp's 2 terms as California Attorney General. First, camp had a clearly defined territorial logic that focused on Humboldt, Mendocino, and Trinity counties at first. A geographical imagination named in press releases as the Emerald Triangle, probably to evoke landscapes of dangerous drug cultivation in Southeast Asia called the Golden Triangle. This meant that each of the 3 counties was the primary operating space for helicopter-based eradication teams that treated neighboring counties, in Humboldt's case Del Norte, as peripheral staging grounds compared with their Emerald Triangle cores. So your teams would be based more or less in the nexus, and they could go out to Del Norte or Shasta or Sonoma or Santa Cruz, and eventually, of course, this spread throughout. The vast majority of camp resources were focused in southern Humboldt and northern Mendocino counties, where back-to-the-land communities were most heavily concentrated. The first new settlers, for example, bought homestead parcels in Whale Gulch, which stretches from Humboldt into Mendocino. The raid teams operated from a playbook that included legally problematic tactics. Raid teams were heavily armed, did not have search warrants, flew helicopters extremely low to the ground, disrupted livestock, damaged property, and did not read their citizens their rights before detaining them. In other words, it was a form of rural policing that bore little relationship to standards of professional police conduct towards citizens with constitutional protections, even when they might be breaking the law. Ray Raphael interviewed a camp commander, Bill Rusamente, in his 1985 book, Cash Crop. Rusamente's quote establishes how one camp commander saw their challenge in the region. Here's the quote, begin quote. The situation that's developed in southern Humboldt and northern Mendocino particularly is that you have vast enclaves of marijuana growers. We're going after the community support system that makes it appear as a viable and legitimate enterprise since everyone around you is doing it. This quote establishes that community support system disruption, not just plant eradication, was considered part of camp's policing mandate. While heavy-handed tactics succeeded in generalizing feelings of insecurity in the region, it also produced a counter-movement. Local citizens, especially those who had been participating in the anti-nuclear movement of the late 1970s and early 1980s, used their knowledge of nonviolent resistance and organizing to create citizen observation groups, or COG. This is from an armband, COG. COG teams would assemble at camp raids to document legally problematic camp procedures, gather evidence that would later be used by a legal team, CLIMP, and to file lawsuits against camp. This happened right away. A legal injunction filed by CLIMP slowed camp down in 1984, and with the threat of legal action, camp was forced to professionalize its tactics to some degree. Although camp reports contested such representations, the success of CLIMP lawsuits in courts suggests otherwise. According to some of my research subjects, COG organizing served to refocus back-to-the-land communities on cultural and political ideals that first brought them there. It also materially brought together topographically distant communities by bringing people in from and around to remote watersheds that may have otherwise been evolving apart. The impression that I have right now is that legally questionable behavior aside, camp helped recreate ideals of community that may have been eroding with the rise of cannabis as an economic commodity rather than a cultural political practice. The community support system was in this sense strengthened rather than weakened by camp. Of course, the culture of fear and secrecy it inspired worked against the health of communities in other ways. This is a good time to transition into camp's economic unintended consequences. which I will analyze by reworking the balloon effect theoretical framework. This begins part 2 of the presentation. What is a balloon effect? It is a fairly straightforward push theory of illicit drug commodity chain relocation due to successful policing efforts. It appears to have been invented in the 1970s by U.S. drug policy functionaries in response to the intensification of opium poppy production in Mexico after the U.S. successfully disrupted production in Turkey. The basic metaphor is clear. It means when you apply pressure to a balloon, the air pops up somewhere else. The air, in this case, materially referring to illicit plant cultivation. International relations scholar Cornelius Friesendorf published a book not long ago demonstrating that while the balloon effect as a push industrial relocation theory shouldn't be discounted, all sorts of pull factors should also be taken into account to explain illicit industrial relocation. In other words, what made Mexico a good place for opium poppy production to expand, besides the fact that it wasn't Turkey? Mexico already had a relatively small share of the market and was increasingly being integrated into illicit North American markets, a process that speeded up rather than started with the implementation of NAFTA. So with that in mind, I first want to describe push factors relating to law and enforcement of rapidly expanding illicit drug policy locally and transnationally, and then describe material changes in the spatial aspects of cannabis agriculture that resulted. So, balloon effects related to transnational policing. Transnational policing practices are widely credited with facilitating the rapid expansion of California sinsemilla production in the late 1970s. The most significant of these has to do with U.S. funding to eradicate cannabis agriculture in Mexico. In 1972, the U.S. began efforts to get Mexico to eradicate cannabis and poppy fields using manual eradication. But in November 1975, the Mexican government commenced spraying marijuana crops with paraquat at the behest of and substantially funded by the U.S. government, primarily to purchase and maintain equipment in support of aerial eradication. By 1979, government sources estimated that these efforts decreased marijuana supplied from Mexico by 75%, with a substantial portion of that drop occurring in the last 2 years of that program, between 1977 and 1979. The State Department estimated that Mexican imports dropped from 40% in 1977 to 9% in 1980, and attributed most of that drop to the use of paraquat. The effectiveness of paraquat eradication program was not simply or even mainly attributable to its effectiveness as an herbicidal defoliant. The widely publicized and controversial practice acted as a strong deterrent to the consumption of Mexican cannabis on the one hand, and a perhaps equally strong incentive for the consumption of cannabis that could be reliably identified as produced elsewhere. Elsewhere at this time included domestic production, California, but also the traditional hemp-growing Appalachian region, and Colombia, parallel with the burgeoning coca-cocaine commodity chain. We can add Hawaii to that as well, and other places. In addition to cannabis eradication efforts in this hemisphere, it should be noted that during the 1970s, Nixon expanded funding and efforts to stop hashish smuggling from North Africa, the Middle East, Central, South, and Southeast Asia, famously paying the King of Nepal, for example, a princely sum to prohibit cannabis production. This geography of enforcement more or less followed a trail blazed by a countercultural smuggling network called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. There's a great book by Nick Shue called Orange Sunshine that documents that historical geography. I recommend it. In any case, all of these translocal enforcement pushes, combined with local ones, to raise the wholesale price per pound of domestic sinsemilla fairly rapidly, reaching around $2,000 a pound by 1980. I now turn to local balloon effects directly related to camp enforcement. I'm going to complicate the balloon effect theoretical framework by considering any spatial change in cannabis agricultural landscapes that directly resulted from camps shifting geographies of enforcement, rather than as simply as geographical dispersion, which the balloon effect is more or less a theory of dispersion. First, though, let's talk about dispersion. A dispersive balloon effect phenomenon occurred when camp focused its federal and state resources in the Emerald Triangle. Simply put, cultivation spread to other counties while these drew fire, so to speak. That's a simplification, of course. Clearly, sinsemilla cultivation was already going on in other counties. but intensified as the 1980s marched on. We can see the data shadow of this in camp eradication statistics. And this should work. All right. So this is sort of a strange graph, and it has been put together by using camp report data on plant eradication by county and taking the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 highest percentage over this very long period of time. It omits between 1996 and 2003 because that information is not available. Those reports appear to have been lost. But it can give you a sense of, there's Humboldt at the bottom, its share of plants eradicated, over 50% in 1984. And you can see also that Mendocino, as a sort of smaller share, is right there, and Trinity, another smaller share. But all three of those were pretty much where the eradication was going on at the beginning of the 1980s. And pretty much up until the end of Van de Kamp's AG tenure. You can see that obviously Santa Cruz, Shasta, Fresno, for example, those were also relatively significant. You can see that eradication actually peaks roughly in 1990, drops off fairly dramatically in 1991 as actually camp budgets take a hit, and then increase throughout the 1990s. That increase you can see is, again, Mendocino and Humboldt County. Now, this is obviously not a decline, but a gap in the graph, right? When the story resumes again, Humboldt, Mendocino, Trinity. There are a very small percentage of plants eradicated over the past decade. Rather, you have the emergence of a new set of foci, which we'll talk about later. And actually, we'll take a look at these graphs separated from the period up to 95 and the period after 2004 in a bit. Oh, that's going to be a fun one. Camp reports also provide an interesting insight into how law enforcement perceived this effect, the push dispersal to other counties. In the early to mid-1980s, camp reports note anxiety from other county law enforcement officials that growers from the Emerald Triangle would literally move themselves elsewhere, and that increasing cultivation in their counties was hypothesized to be the result of that. This sort of hypothesis emerged from a problematic understanding of cannabis cultivators as a new organized crime group rather than a networked collection of homesteaders and subsequent new settlers who came to stay on the land rather than move away from it. Camp considered the hypothesis, but by 1987 report finding no evidence that this was the case. Instead, it appeared that growers in other counties were being pulled into the industry by rapidly rising prices that were the direct effect of successfully preventing cultivation from growing in the Emerald Triangle. I will consider the pull effects of rising prices as part of how camp balloon effects didn't just disperse cannabis agriculture away from the Emerald Triangle. But first, I want to look at changes in actually cultivation to avoid surveillance, especially by helicopters. In addition to being dispersed, my reworked consideration of the balloon effect as a theory of how geographies of policing affect spatial change can also be applied to how landscapes of cannabis cultivation changed in the Emerald Triangle, in addition to being dispersed throughout the state. Some of the changes were not exclusive to the region, but pioneered new methods for managing risk of exposure to camp enforcement that would be echoed elsewhere. Outdoor growers that previously may have grown tall, robust plants in the most favorable location for sunlight adapted their planting locations to less favorable spots. They planted multiple gardens rather than single closely grouped ones, multiplying the labor necessary to realize harvest. They planted in the shade where the plants were harder to detect from the air. They even planted up trees. One Salmon Creek homesteader recalled selecting a spot with less shade but at an angle to the sun that could maximize in the fall when plants were finishing. All of this meant smaller yields per plant, much smaller yields per plant. And again, more plants were needed to maintain income levels, although rising prices surely helped. Smaller plants were also increasingly grown indoors. Today, indoor production is everywhere, in urban and rural areas throughout the state, and indeed throughout the country. I would hazard to guess that there are quite a few of you in this room. In the watersheds of southern Humboldt, many growers responded to camp's main surveillance innovation, helicopters, by adapting indoor structures into enclosed gardens, not to be confused with greenhouses, although such structures also manage risk of exposure to enforcement through the same legal codes. My research so far indicates that the indoor strategy on a mass scale was pioneered by the Homestead's second-generation growers, who were perhaps less reluctant to use off-grid diesel generators than their parents. The technique was neither entirely new nor particularly effective at first. One of my interviewees, who long ago stopped growing but is the son of a first-wave new settler, took me to the structure where he and his brother attempted the first indoor grow in their watershed community around 1982. I'm omitting the names of communities in certain parts, right? It was not a financial success, and the effort was not repeated, and it did make a big mess. Over the next 2 decades, diesel grows multiplied in the hills, and the art of indoor growing improved dramatically. The move indoor moved the plants into another legal space, not only hidden from the helicopters, but protected more securely by laws protecting private property. The move to rural indoor gardens affected the morphology of the plants themselves, which were smaller and yielded less. Indoor techniques created new economic linkages and new environmental problems. Indoor grows required different kinds of equipment, grow lights, for an obvious example, that were a boon to local supply stores and gas stations selling diesel fuel. I should observe here that the infrastructural cost of indoor grows is significantly greater than that of outdoor, and was made possible by the rise of wholesale prices over time. Now we're going to take a look at some prices. Camp balloon effects, as discussed above, helped maintain cannabis industrial structure, the cannabis industrial structure as a highly decentralized network of small producers, which Ray Raphael calls democratic capitalism, again from Cash Crop. Begin quote. Apparently, consolidation is an inevitable feature of capitalism, except in the case of marijuana farming. In the marijuana industry, there are structural forces that counteract the tendency towards centralization. The combination of illegality and isolation provide built-in guarantees against consolidation. As the government eradicates the larger, more visible plantations, the less visible and safer enterprises might enjoy a greater share of the market. Governmental eradication of marijuana agribusiness, therefore, can serve as a protective subsidy for small independent growers, doing as much for the cause of democratic capitalism as the Small Business Administration could ever hope to. That's Raphael in 1985. This brings me to a consideration of how camp's repressive push pressure also created a pull factor that interacted productively with spatial cultivation innovations. Almost everyone I've talked to describes camp, sometimes nostalgically, as a price support program, as described above by Raphael. This inflated and sustained a commodity boom that, in an illicit market, always ends in overproduction that drives down prices. The effect was the same as that produced by economic cartel formation, where a group of producers agrees to restrict production to gain economic rents above those that would be possible in a competitive industry. Higher prices made more expensive indoor production not only possible but profitable, kind of like how higher oil prices make offshore drilling much more attractive than when prices are low. Let's take a look at that story over time. The camp reports have county-specific price data per pound that, as I talked to interviewees, did not seem necessarily all that accurate. And to the extent that they can remember, I was given sort of vague impressions sort of earlier in this history and more precise ones as we went along about the trajectory of wholesale prices per pound over time. Now, this is the nominal educated guess. So if you want to talk to me afterward about like my logic in putting those prices down in an Excel file and making a line out of it that is precise but not accurate, let's just say. Right? The important thing here is that the shape of the curves are fairly accurate. I also ran this by Kevin Jodry yesterday after the K-Mud radio show, and he helped me make just a couple of adjustments, but otherwise seemed to think that it was relatively accurate. I've also got the adjusted for inflation prices above the blue line. So the nominal prices are below, The adjusted for inflation prices are above, and that's $2012. Right? You can see, of course, during the peak years of camp intensity, the price went up and stayed up and more or less plateaued over time with small variations per year. Towards the end of the 1990s, you received the nominal peak, which is not the inflation-adjusted peak. And you have, at the beginning of the 2000s, a step down, a step down, and a step down until approximately 2006, when the price, which had otherwise been hovering around $4,500 a pound, $4,500 to $5,000 a pound, dropped to $3,500, $2,500, roughly $1,600. These prices, by the way, are, I would characterize, southern Humboldt outdoor growing prices. Indoor prices are different. There have been sort of a premium for indoor for a brief period of time. Before that, actually, indoor was cheaper. But these are specific to this region, specific to homestead growers. You can see, of course, the absolute floor, which I pegged at roughly $1,500 or $1,600 a pound. You hear much lower prices, but for the most part, the homestead growers were not getting the much lower prices. They had better contacts. They had a different product. So although you may hear of those $800 a pound prices, they did not necessarily apply in a widespread fashion in southern Humboldt. Nonetheless, it was a pretty big drop. Now, when you think about it as there's a risk premium built into these prices, those higher prices look like, oh, that's amazing that we're getting these huge high prices. It also went along with increased risk. Right? The risk of losing your crop entirely was factored into the price to some extent. So whatever rewards they got or rents they may have captured by not getting caught were offset by all sorts of other things. At the industry level, these strategies were successful. The strategies of innovating to avoid surveillance, right? Camp had to do more work to find gardens on the one hand, and indoor growing's year-round seasonality meant that camp wasn't even looking for them 10 months out of 12. Rather than eliminating an Emerald Triangle agriculture, camp policing in the region produced intra- and translocal balloon effects that evolved regional cannabis agriculture, spread it throughout the state, and reinforced outdoor and indoor growing developments throughout the state and across the country. The spread of indoor and outdoor cultivation meant that camp itself had to evolve geographically, and evolve it did. Camp spread from its initial focus on the watersheds of Humboldt, Mendocino, and Trinity counties to most of the rest of the state by the end of the 1980s. The last mention of the Emerald Triangle as a place name in the camp reports was 1987. While plenty of resources remained in Humboldt and Mendocino, Trinity became just another minor county amongst literally dozens of others by the end of the 1980s. To illustrate this, I've broken up the data underlying the previous graph of the 6 major theaters of camp operations between 84 and 95 using camp eradication data. So this is continuous data, more or less. You can see that while they may have spread throughout the state, there remained a fairly strong focus, especially in the mid-90s, after a brief period of time when, for example, Butte's eradication numbers went up, or Santa Cruz's eradication numbers might have gone up, right? You can see actually Santa Barbara at the very top. In the late 80s, Santa Barbara actually for a bit was much bigger than Trinity in terms of eradication, plants eradicated. Right? Something similar could be said about Mendocino and Humboldt at the beginning of the 21st century, but more on that later. These statistics should be thought of as data shadows rather than accurate reflections of where cannabis agriculture was at a given point in time. And this is actually, this was supposed to be my Monica Stevens call out. Geographer Monica Stevens is going to talk about data shadows for the Institute in the spring. The eradication numbers for each county are fairly volatile. A large bust in a given season indicates that a large bust was discovered and acted upon, not that there weren't other large grows in each given county. Plant counts, too, are not necessarily accurate, since camp law enforcement officers were focused on raids over keeping meticulous counts, although plants meant budgets. So there was an incentive to have fairly accurate counting. Yeah?
How does the magnitude of their eradication change over this time? You know, like, are they eradicating like 100 million?
Right.
Or is it
Yeah.
kind of tied over time?
Yeah. I would say that the eradication statistics, rather than the percentage of plants eradicated, show a lot more plants being eradicated in these other counties much more clearly than just simply the percentage, right? That lots more plants were being eradicated in other counties, even if the top 6 don't pop up in the percentage eradicated, right? Because there are, in general, lower camp numbers in the 90s than there were in the 80s, right? I should have actually made a graph, and that question is going to make me go ahead and do that for the paper. I really appreciate that. We can talk about it afterward, and we can look at the numbers together. No, it's a great question. It's a great question. Plant counts too are not necessarily accurate. As time went on, camp became one of many other county and local law enforcement institutions that eradicated cannabis year-round, for example, whose eradication numbers are not aggregated here. This is just camp numbers. And camp is an outdoor seasonal program, right? Quite simply, the territorial logic of camp policing attempted to keep pace with balloon effects that were significantly the result of its material geographies of enforcement. At the same time, state politics came together in such a way that the camp budget was reduced between 1990 and 1996. Remember, the hypothesis is that camp was catalyzed by John Van de Kamp's effort to produce political capital by participating in a moral panic around marijuana grown by what might have been perceived as the losers of the 1960s culture wars, back to the land hippies. Who in Reagan's California in the early 1980s couldn't get behind that? Van de Kamp finished his tenure as Attorney General in 1991, actually ran for governor in 1990, lost the primary election, and appears to have been in private practice ever since. The politics of the policy's creation were forgotten, and camp evolved as a bureaucratic institution from a skirmish amongst many others in the local and national culture wars. That evolution clearly included its professionalization as COG and CLIMP civil liberty lawsuits and grassroots action brought its operations more in line with constitutional protections afforded the policing of citizens rather than the fighting of enemies of society. Because camp appears to have lost track of the reports it produced between 1997 and 2003, there are no data shadows from which to derive hypotheses of gradual change during this time period. The third part of my presentation concerns marked shifts in territorial logic and practice of camp policing since that gap, leading up to its discontinuation this year, with a little context from my interviews to clarify the picture. This is part 3. When the trail picks up again in 2004, it's obvious that the logic and practice of camp policing had changed dramatically. Eradication numbers dwarfed those produced in the intense 1980s. I produced a graph showing the top counties by plants eradicated between 2004 and 2009. Without historical memory, we might call Lake Shasta and Tuolumne, if I'm pronouncing that wrong, please forgive me. Can somebody else say it for me? No, not Tulare, Tuolumne. Tuolumne, sorry about that. Okay. The Emerald Triangle, without historical memory, we might call Lake Shasta and Tuolumne the Emerald Triangle during this decade. So in this graph, what you have is your big 3 at the bottom, and by far, Lake Shasta, and Tulare, sorry, I wrote Tuolumne, but I meant Tulare. Sorry about that. Great. Tulare, great. Can you tell I'm not from California? I'm not a local, as folks keep reminding me. County names escape me. So Mendocino also remains pretty big. Riverside and Fresno both with more plants eradicated during this period of time as a percentage of total eradication than Humboldt, which appears at the top in the very light blue part, right? This eradication was taking place on public land and large old timber estates. Right? One thing is clear, a lot more cannabis was eradicated on public lands in the early 2000s than before. Whether this is because massive public land growths had gone undetected before is unknown. The helicopters disappeared from the traditional Emerald Triangle practically unnoticed, virtually everyone I asked could not remember the last time they saw a helicopter. A camp helicopter, not just a helicopter. Right? The long-term trend away from camp helicopters concentrating the Emerald Triangle clearly took root in the late 1980s and transformed completely over the course of the 1990s. By 2003, camp was mostly concentrated on public land, megagrows, and comparably sized operations on timber estates. How and when the ratio of public to private land camp rates changed over time remains unclear. At the moment, I hope to be able to talk to law enforcement officials that could shed some light on that. The shift in camp's priorities to public and private land megagrows was accompanied by two new discourses of social threat, which is clear in the emphasis of camp reports between 2004 and 2006. First, camp was now specifically legitimized as a rural task force concerned with ecological damage. This is not a new discourse. Early camp reports included but did not prioritize descriptions of environmental damage associated with cannabis agriculture. This discourse of legitimation is clearly not exaggerated, although it is not clear just what percentage of cannabis agriculture in California can be attributed to megagrows on public or indeed private land. Don't know what they are as a size of the overall output, right? Since 1996, indoor and outdoor 215 gardens have multiplied tremendously throughout the state. Nonetheless, as one institution for policing cannabis among many others now, it seems reasonable rather than exaggerated grounds for turning camp's attention to environmental damage from outdoor megagrows that harvest about the same time the outdoor grows always have, in the fall. In addition, it was a non-controversial and even popular strategy for everyone I have spoken with. Not surprising given that cannabis growers in southern Humboldt have traditionally, many of them, spent so much of their spare time participating in and organizing around environmental issues. In this regard, the shift in territorial logic of camp policing marked the end of camp as my research subjects knew it, as an antagonistic outside force. Camp's politics, as it reached maturity, changed in a way that was more favorable to those it once policed, as well as to voters who were increasingly accepting of cannabis in society, but also increasingly concerned about environmental issues. The second shift in the territorial logic of camp policing is a bit more complicated. It was alleged that the main source of that damage and the growers on public lands were Mexican cartels. The 2004 report attributes precise percentages of public land grows to Mexican organizations, and indeed there's no evidence to dispute their precise if unverifiable calculations. Most of my interviewees agree that it seems likely that many large outdoor grows on public lands were and remain attributable to Mexican organized crime. Although I'll add, most of the public land mega grows were not in Humboldt. Many of them were in Mendocino, but to a large degree, the King Range, which is the closest, largest public land to the west of the 101, back to the landers. There really wasn't much public land grows. I can talk a little bit about that because I talked to a BLM official who kind of explained that phenomenon. In other words, my informants wouldn't necessarily know, right? However, they point out that they do know of many mega grows done by second-generation new settlers and organized crime groups from around the world, not just Mexico, Eastern Europe, for example. I interviewed Tom Ullman 2 years ago and asked about this characterization. One of his lieutenants, Rusty Noe, with a long history of camp participation, responded that that was a hypothesis. He actually said, that's pure speculation. I don't think he meant that to actually cast doubt on it, so I'm going to say that what he meant was that's a hypothesis. That up to this point, no cases had been successfully closed that directly implicated anything more than Mexican laborers in such gardens. He did, however, indicate that the circumstantial evidence was compelling. Many mega grows were planted like cannabis grows in Mexico. I know maybe some of you have also heard him talk about how because they found beans and tortillas at sites, that was also solid evidence. But this was a sort of more reasonable option he gave me. The point I want to make is that while Mexican drug trafficking organizations do seem to be a significant part of the picture, camp reports that asserted with absolute confidence that they were all of the picture were clearly not distributing responsibility in an accurate or transparent, evidence-based fashion. It seems to many of my subjects that such exaggeration plays into racial politics that have shaped drug war policy since the beginning of the 20th century, but in a 21st century context, where such representations play into public debates about immigrants and immigration in the age of NAFTA. In any case, after the 2005 report, camp reports consisted of one page listing basic eradication and arrest statistics for each participating county. A lot of the detail from the longer reports just was gone, including any reference to Mexican cartels. For whatever reason, possibly budgetary considerations, camp stopped reporting on why it was policing, where it was policing, and simply published the results. Federal and county policing efforts had by then shifted from rural to urban cannabis agriculture associated with the explosion of medical dispensaries operating in and around legal gray zones opened up by 1996's Prop 215, 2003's SB 420, and the dizzying ecology of county and local ordinances relating to cannabis agriculture that are still ongoing, still changing. These were beyond the scope of camp as a seasonal, outdoor-oriented drug war institution, and it seems clear that the DEA, in conjunction with county sheriffs and California's U.S. attorneys, see dispensaries as the front line of ongoing debates about the place of cannabis in public order. When California's long budgetary decline flared into a flirtation with bankruptcy in the wake of the 2007 financial crisis, the writing may have been on the wall. This year, California's Attorney General's office ended the primary state funding vehicle for camp, the State Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement, or BNE, and camp was laid to rest. It remains to be seen what its successor institution, the Cannabis Eradication Reclamation Team, or CERT, will do or evolve into, but state resources associated with CERT are funneled through environmental agencies such as the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, rather than policing institutions such as the BNE. In some ways, this seems to be just a recognition of what camp had already evolved into. At any rate, federal DEA resources are currently concentrated on urban fronts and public land investigations, but they may also be drawn into rural policing efforts by county sheriffs, as Mike Downey indicated he was trying to do a couple of months ago, but appears not to have succeeded in doing. I want to conclude by briefly assessing what I'm tentatively calling the reinflation effect, a pull theory of illicit industrial change that has partially been shaped by the withdrawal of camp focus on the Emerald Triangle. Many of my interviewees express a sometimes ironic, sometimes sincere nostalgia for the days of camp. Foremost on their minds is usually the price decline associated with the sort of overproduction that usually signifies the end of a commodity bust, though it appears that federal policing efforts elsewhere, in conjunction with other factors, seem to have stabilized the wholesale price per pound at the moment. But they also express sadness for the return of a phenomenon associated with the end of the 1970s, when more and more people migrated to watersheds intent on making a lot of money, not concerned with establishing themselves in a community, and certainly not too concerned with environmental damage. On the plus side, the evacuation of camp from the area in combination with community organizing has returned watershed production outdoors, which is less environmentally damaging by far. Community organizing has also emerged around questions of water conservation. More and more homesteads now have water tanks for collecting rainfall in the winter to water their gardens in the dry late summer and early fall months. This eases pressure on watersheds that have been devastated by many factors besides cannabis agriculture. Forest regrowth draws more and more water from the ecosystem every year. Thank you, Woods. In addition to yet to be understood effects related to global climate change. A sort of organizing, putting water storage tanks in the hills, was less tenable when camp helicopters roamed the skies looking for evidence of gardens from above. Water storage tanks would have been a dead giveaway. I want to say that also homestead production is clearly a much smaller part of the overall production story than it used to be. That there certainly are larger grows in the hills, and not all of them are people who came from outside. Many of them clearly are second-generation growers. Whether they do a lot of environmental damage as a result is not necessarily a foregone conclusion, but it's harder to manage necessarily community standards around growing in such a situation. So this concludes my paper presentation. There are many parts of the story that have been left out to focus as directly as possible on camp. I'm happy to take any questions about the presentation, in particular my research project in general, but first I want to do just a quick thank you to some folks. There have been many extraordinarily kind and generous people who have helped guide me on this journey. I want to thank two people in particular without whose initial guidance I could not have gotten anywhere. One of them is in this room, Dr. Tony Salvaggio, who met with me 2.5 years ago when I first came to Humboldt County with only a seed of an idea for the project and how to go about it. Second person is not in the room, and the main gatekeeper who allowed me into the social world of Sohum is Dr. Gentry Anders, cultural anthropologist, former instructor here at Humboldt State University, and one of the new settlers who came to this area seeking a place to make something new from the culture wars of the 1960s, a project of community formation beyond counterculture. If you haven't read her book, I think it's as good a place to start as any to learn about how domestic agriculture was born from the ashes of new social movements associated in popular memory with the 1960s. So thank you, Tony, and thank you, Gentry, for your guidance and kindness. I owe this project to you both. I also want to thank Josh Mizell and Paul Mon for putting together such a great poster and publicizing the talk via press release. Thank you, Josh and Paul. There are many people to whom I owe profuse and public gratitude. At the moment, I especially want to thank Dottie and Graham Russell, who have hosted me at their lovely Madrona Court cottages on this leg of my research project. And finally, I want to thank my Sarah Lawrence College research assistants, Uday Keith and Stephanie Permute, for the help of this project. And thanks to all those of you who know who you are in this room, who I could just go on and on, but I should probably bring the talk to a close. But Ursi and Woods that I can see off the top of my head, thank you both very much. I'm happy to take any questions about the presentation in particular and my research project in general.
About what counties has the most marijuana growing.
Yeah.
We're always disappointed if we're not the first one.
Well, you've come a long way, you know. You definitely have a lot more than you used to. In the camp reports, I've got the Excel file that actually shows fairly detailed trajectories in Santa Barbara, and we can take a look at those actually.
But it wasn't big enough to make that.
Right, yeah. It wasn't enough to sort of place in the competition for the particular time periods, that's going to change if it's like 84 to 86 or whatever else. Yeah.
You said that outdoor grows are worse for the environment than indoor?
No, I said indoor grows. Yeah.
And how many quote informants do you have? Like, do you think that was a good amount for like a statistically good sample?
It's ongoing, but we're at about 40 right now.
40? You said I think it's 10% of 40. Or
10% of those would be people who had no direct association with growing. No direct association with growing. So lawyers would count, for example. Health professionals, folks working in community health centers as well. Yeah. Yes.
I wish I could remember when the land confiscation effort started for people who were busted. The higher the equity they had in their property, the more likely it was they were to be severely prosecuted. And I didn't hear that factored into.
Haven't run across that yet. Thanks for bringing that to my attention.
I think it contributed to indoor grow.
Well, can I get your name maybe afterward?
Yeah,
And
I'm going to go to supper with you afterwards. But,
oh, great.
And maybe introduce yourself.
Yeah.
You're part of.
Yeah.
She's also part of the institute. Maybe.
But I don't. Does somebody in the room remember when the feds, the states collaborated with the feds to start confiscating properties? 91, 92, I think it was.
Yeah, I need to hear more about that. I just simply haven't run into folks who brought it up.
The reason it ended as a program was because the courts held that they could only seize the land, the part of the land that was actually being used to commit the offense. So that meant they could no longer just go in and grab up people's land. And that's what put an end to that kind of enforcement.
Before that was decided, did they actually successfully get large?
They tried to,
Okay.
and it went to court, and it was thrown out finally.
What I recall is the fear in the land
Yeah.
about that.
One other thing I will mention, Dominic, is we found that camp lied extensively about the amount of plants that they took. They commonly, for example, if they netted up plants in pots with soil, they would weigh it all and they would calculate it based on the soil also.
Yeah.
And other agencies, such as Bureau of Land Management, had a much more honest way
Yeah.
of counting their plants.
Yeah.
But Camp always lied, and I think it has to do with the political aspect and also the economic, the
Yeah.
funding that they got
Yeah.
from the feds based on the number of plants.
I have another thing to add to that.
Yeah.
It turned out it was my job for our library here on campus to get those reports from the late 90s.
Yeah.
And I tried very hard because I knew any data was data,
Yeah.
even though it was so flawed. And was unsuccessful and was finally told, no, there are no reports. Well, I know every bean counter has reports. So they called them something different. They were no longer called annual reports, and I could not get information about what they were called. And then come these later on these one-sheeters.
Yeah.
It was all on one sheet. So I really think that the political pressures that went into how the things were counted and weighed were very different,
Yeah.
and that the chart needs to be severed
Yeah.
at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And so you have some reports from the early 2000s
No, 2003. I have the ones that you've got, basically.
from the last.
All the ones from the Humboldt State Library. Yep. Yeah.
Some of those came in later, but it was a struggle.
It's good to hear the story of that search for it, because Josh Mizell, I've made efforts sort of independently, and Josh more or less told me, dude, I've already tried that, and I've more or less kind of given up on it. They, as far as anybody's concerned, they're just gone.
Right, and they called them something different, and we don't know what they were.
Oh, so they might exist, but they're
So,
called something different.
If you probably have to go to the agency library there and probably do a FOIA request or something.
Yeah, right.
So you have to get really.
You think they would have been filed in D.C.?
No, it would have.
Because camp no longer even exists.
Well, it would have how they ever report about the DEA funds, but then you've got to factor in
Yeah.
too many things. I don't know the formula for that stuff.
No.
But at the state level, you have to figure out the vocabulary and then find the pressure point.
Well, any tips that you can give me, and also Josh, because I know he's looking at the reports.
Yeah, because of Josh's
Yeah.
efforts, those more recent ones are available.
Yeah. It'd be great to get those, because they give us quite imperfect information, extremely imperfect, and maybe I didn't emphasize that enough in the paper. But they're all we've got to go on, and which is why I kind of keep wanting to emphasize this term data shadows. When you put precise numbers or graphs with non-fuzzy borders up, it looks authoritative. But I wanted to warn you, like, these are data shadows. These are definitely not, shouldn't be taken as exactly what happened. But given the knowledge that we have, we've got to work with it. The other option is just simply leaving it alone, right? But I think to complicate it, and that's part of the oral history project, really, to talk to folks who lived through it, and ideally I'd also like to talk to law enforcement officers who lived through it as well. Who might be able to shed some light, clarify those shadows a little bit.
So after camp starts, they're busting the homestead growers. Then after a few years, they move into busting larger growers on public lands, and then they run out of funding, basically.
That's a very simplified version of the story. Again, the homestead growers, they were the first ones. But as early as the 1970s, people were moving in that were not necessarily homestead growers. People were buying land from the city, assigning teams on the land to grow. They started, buying up property that, may have been in or around some of these communities that were largely dominated by the back-to-landers, but they also especially spread across the 101, although there are back-to-landers in Alder Point and Harris and so forth. But the communities that were like core back-to-land communities, we're talking especially Whale Gulch, Bryceland, Salmon Creek. And not like they don't have non-homestead growers, they have plenty of those too at this point. So it was definitely a change over time. And the homestead growers' children, yeah. Well, but they don't, the thing is that they tend not to share necessarily the sort of political radicalism of their parents. Now, what that means and what kind of judgment is to be made on that, that's up to each person. The rest of the United States, is looking to be comfortable too, right? I don't know why we would single out second-generation growers as evil for what they're doing, but that they became more like the rest of the United States in terms of values.
Right. In the percentages that you had of the bus for, where were like the larger public land bus versus the homestead bus?
Yeah, so in the later years, definitely Shasta, Lake, Tulare,
Okay.
Siskiyou. The BLM, my BLM guy, Gary Pritchard Peterson, actually said something interesting, which was folks were growing on public lands in the early days, but a number of other factors besides, conscience, moved those to more remote public lands. The King Range is these days a much more traversed public land. There's lots of folks going through it. So often the discourse is, well, growers, push tourism out. Well, tourism also pushes growers out. And the other thing is that actually foliage came up. What used to be like sunny areas where you could just plant, actually are now there's a heavy canopy, and they're not really ideal for growing lots of big plants.
Well, my name is Gary Hughes, and I work with the Environmental Protection Information Center, and I've had these same conversations with folks that are managing in the King Range. And the other thing is that you're not mentioning is the phenomena of 215. And the fact that people had a safer space within which they could be growing near their homes, and they no longer had to venture into the King Range backcountry.
Yeah.
So 1996, 215 changed a lot of the dynamics around the King Range, but the United States Forest Service lands, the Mendocino, National Forest 6 Rivers, Klamath, Shasta Trinity, these are all forests that have been under quite a bit of pressure from these trespass grows.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that detail there.
215 had a major positive impact on the integrity of the King Range.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that definitely is also sort of, in my view, part of how it had a positive impact on outdoor grows and getting out of indoor growing, more broadly speaking. But I should definitely make sure that I bring that up explicitly, actually, when I talk a bit more maybe in the paper or in other parts of the paper, because there's different chapters. This one's more about camp. I'm going to talk a little bit more about ecological stuff in maybe another chapter of the project. That's a key one to bring up. I appreciate that.
Do you have any numbers on prosecutions, state and federal prosecutions that correspond with your graphs of adaptation?
Well, there were a lot more arrests in the early days of camp, but for the most part, people who were raided did not get put through the legal system. Charges would be dropped. It's expensive to try somebody. And if you have actually legal strategies in place and pretty good lawyers like Ron Sinaway that continuously get people off, they had to kind of back off with any attempt to increase arrests.
Federal mandatory minimum sentencing.
Yeah.
Around the same time.
Yes, the 1980s. Absolutely. It's part of that picture of the 1980s with all sorts of drug war legislation being passed. And those particular federal sentencing guidelines had a big effect on at least sort of estimating, what plant size you're going to do. I mean, 99 plants in Humboldt County, that's one below the first federal sentencing guideline of 100. It's stepped. 1,000 is a lot more, for example. So if you want to have a sort of a rule of thumb for what's big, I mean, technically in terms of what you can get in federal court, as far as sentencing goes, over 1,000 is pretty big. Over 100 can still land you 5 years in prison. So, what's big refers to many things, but also, well, what's the risk here? How big is the risk associated with X size grow? That's also kind of harder to, be very precise about how many plants you grow, right? If you're growing from seeds, you've got to pull males. You don't necessarily know how many are going to be left over, et cetera, et cetera.
So you talk about the politics, right? I'm more like interested in the economics of it, right?
Sure.
So like your recent, graphs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Given that, I'd like to see something, and maybe you know something about this, where you're seeing like overall GDP based off of like growth, right? In regards to cannabis versus like tourism within the region here, and see if there's a correlation between when tourism gets bigger, like more property, right, is bought because of tourism, whatnot, and if actual prices of marijuana like would go down, or if it goes back up, depending on eradication.
It's my impression that there would be no significant relationship.
Well, I'm just saying, just because this coming from the economic side of the house.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Sure, yeah.
I'd say that there probably would be something right there, just because, like you said before on your statement, when you were talking about how the BLM.
Sure, yeah,
Right.
yeah. Well, I mean, one thing to keep in mind, though, is like, I don't know necessarily if I'd phrase it as tourism, but people who come up to retire in the hills, like a couple of teachers from Colorado that I met,
Right.
they got a property and they're just having a good old time growing a few plants. They adapted to the area rather than not.
So I think that would be like a key point as
Yeah.
far as interest in
Yeah.
the politics, right?
Yeah, I think that there are many very worthwhile research questions to ask, and I definitely would encourage you. I don't have, enough of a sense of that relation to be able to give you a very good answer, and I apologize for that.
Couple more, I guess? Well, I was just going to comment that, there is a lot of marijuana tourism that occurs.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Hemp Connection, which sells hemp clothing in Garberville, says that they have about 2 people a day come in and ask to try to buy marijuana from them. So there's quite a bit of
Which only tourists would do.
marijuana tourism.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just have one question about eradication numbers. I think it was 2010, we had around 7.5 million plants eradicated in California. And this last year, the data just came out, and one of my colleagues showed me the numbers. It was like 3.6 is what they eradicated. And law enforcement they point to that number and they say, see, this is our eradication efforts are working, because there's 4 million plants that less than last year we've eradicated. And I'm just wondering there's a lot of ways to look at that number.
Yeah.
You got anything
Yeah.
you want to share with us about how to interpret that sort of stuff?
Well, the numbers are, magnitudes greater than those from the 1980s and 1990s. And they are probably just as likely to be subject to, the politics of accounting that are associated with funding programs. I don't know, Tony, honestly. It occurs to me that, mega grows on public lands should be some of the easiest grows to locate and bust for many reasons. One of which is that, you can see greenhouses from the satellite. Why can't you just sort of like watch, a huge clear cut happen? Because it needs a huge clear cut to actually to grow, 50,000 plants necessarily. But also, it's not like there are a whole bunch of different roads into these lands. How hard can it be to surveil them? And you need a fair amount of soil and other kinds of equipment that has to go in before cultivation happens. It's possible that they're getting more effective simply because, they couldn't not get more effective. Maybe, I don't know. What do you think?
That's a future presentation.
Yeah. All right.
We can talk for hours. So
Excellent.
we're going to wrap it up here.
All right.
That's
Yeah,
okay.
sounds good. Yeah.
Thank you, Dominic, for showing up. We appreciate it.
Thank you, buddy.
And I want to add, we have another person going to be talking.